Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Appreciate you being here. My name's Rob Duffield. I'm a professor of sport and exercise science at the University of Technology, Sydney, and I also have a role as head of research and development, Football Australia. My little presentation this evening for you will be about recovery with a bit of a focus on football, but not exclusive to football. So again, thank you for joining us, and thank you to the organising committee for the invitation. So over the next kind of 40 odd minutes, we'll go through a few major factors or a few major topics. The first is, what is recovery? So a brief definition and description of conceptually what recovery exists of. Go through, in certainly our particular view, what are some of the major factors that are involved in the recovery process or that can affect the recovery process, being the load, match or training, nutrition, as well as hydration, covered off in that, the presence or absence of sleep, and the effect of travel. Some other considerations we'll then go through include some of the common recovery modalities, cold water immersion and compression, briefly allude to any considerations for female athlete recovery, and then talk about these concepts of fitness and availability as like small items to consider, and then we'll summarize and wrap it up with some basic applications. So let's get into it. What is recovery? And as you can see there from a definition, recovery is a multifaceted restorative process that's relative in time to the load that has been exposed to prior to. So we know that recovery is this change, whether it's physiological, whether it's performance, whether it's perceptual, as a result of a training or match stimulus, and the restorative process of returning to or nearby the baseline values, whether they be optimal or suboptimal. The recovery timeline is essentially what we're after. And that recovery timeline is going to be different for different factors. Again, whether it's different physiological mechanisms or markers, different perceptual markers or performance markers. Regardless of what the marker is, the idea for us as a practitioner in sports science or sports medicine is to shift that theoretical recovery timeline to the left, so as that players are in a better state earlier and prepared for whatever the next load is, match or training, in a sooner or shorter time frame. And certainly what we should be doing is preventing a delay or retarding that process to have negative benefits or negative preparation for ensuing competition or training purposes. But essentially recovery is this restorative process that's going to be specific to the load and specific to the mechanism or marker that we're interested in. Which I guess brings us to that concept of, how to approach recovery or what is recovery. And you can think of recovery as being a readiness to perform. So whether that be performance, which is quite often our most important focus, the ability to produce power or force through the muscle in a particular technique or action, whether that football specific or otherwise, and or the absence of injury. This is probably the most important to know. This is probably our holy grail, but it's probably the hardest to know because testing of physical performance before training or before a match, is kind of what we all strive to figure out the best way to do it. I guess physiologically, recovery is the way we have a default thinking, whether it's the restoration of muscle damage, the carbohydrate depletion and repletion, or hypohydration, dehydration, and rehydration practices as examples. Obviously, the physiological restoration is one of the key areas that we look at as sports science, sports medicine. But we also have mood, motivation, and otherwise perceptual markers. These are the probably easiest to measure, quite often undervalued because of the simplicity and questionable validity that sometimes sit around simple Likert kind of scales. But again, these are different approaches to a recovery process, whether it's the ability to perform, the physiological state, or recovering the human who is also an athlete as well. So regardless of that quick skip through what is recovery, there are some major factors that we consider important to the recovery process. The first one is the load exposure, either the prior or re-exposure to load. The second being nutrition and hydration. And then you have sleep and travel as additional potential barriers to the recovery restorative process. Let's look at the first one. So recovery in football. So we know that probably the biggest load that a football player will encounter in any microcycle is the match load. And when we look at a fairly well-known and fairly well-established recovery profiles from systematic reviews that are dated are probably still apt and still appropriate. It seems like 72 hours is probably the minimum time frame for sufficient post-match recovery for most players. And here's just an example of a series of studies whereby 72 hours, you can see most sprint and repeat sprint abilities are back to similar to baseline. We know that physiological markers, particularly creatine kinase and other markers of muscle damage that are often used in football, may be out to 126 hours for the recovery process, but often they're not related to the actual ability to perform musculoskeletal action at that moment. So 72 hours is generally the timeline, the rule of thumb, and most football policies for congested schedules sit around that 72 hours as being the minimum standard. More recently in female athletes, we probably see a fairly similar timeline, whereby whether it's performance measures, being counter movement jumps, sprints, are returned to baseline by 72 hours. Again, we see this longer period of time for recovery of physiological variables, being muscle damage and inflammation type measures, which may be longer. And again, perceptual measures recovered by around about 72 hours. So even in female athletes who are thought of having lower high intensity loads in a match, but those low intensity loads are still relative to exposure and experience, 72 hours seems like the minimum standard for recovery timelines. So if the recovery process requires around 72 hours, that gives us our sort of standard timeline for recovery processes. However, when we add a second match to that timeline, so in a congested schedule, we see data from the A-League or A-League clubs that we've worked with, whereby we have, with a second match within 3 days, all perceptual variables are exacerbated and worse off following the second match compared to the same time frame following the first match. We also see the exacerbation of hip adduction, fatigue, and soreness and sleep measures as well. So that second match being that second volume of high load, we see being an extension and elongation of the recovery timeline. From a multi-match perspective, some of the data that we've collected and analysed from our national women's team, Matildas, when we see repeated matches in a tournament setting out to 5 or 6 matches, we see some of the major factors in that the more minutes that are played by a player, the increased total prior exposure during the tournament, and the reduction in the number of days between games all contribute to a reduction in match running performance throughout those matches. And that's taking into account the level of competition as well. So again, repeated exposure to increased loads slows what is essentially a recovery timeline. And to just re-image that and show you things like increased time on pitch, decreased number of days between matches, increased prior match exposure, all have the biggest effect on total distance in a match and high speed running. So although this is a match running performance analysis, it still equates to the increased load exposure will retard or slow the recovery process and then have potential effects on performance, physical variables, physiological variables, and or perceptual variables with that increased exposure and reduced time to recover. So I guess that's in that match, the increased match load slows or alters that recovery timeline. It hints to load probably being the largest influence, or the presence of load being the largest influence on the recovery timeline. And when we look at post-match training, and this is data from a female Brazilian club, looking at when to undertake resistance training following a match. And when we see an additional training load provided following the match, we see an alteration of a recovery timeline, even a small one. So in this case, the players undertook a high speed, high power, but short or small volume training session at either 24 hours after a match or on another match, 48 hours after the match, with measures then determined at 72 hours as if they had a third match. So you can see there in this case, actually training the day after the match in the gym had a better recovery state at 72 hours because there was more time between the last session or the last load and when they theoretically would play again, as opposed to longer load for longer recovery after the match and then training again closer to the next match. So again, it depends on what the load is and how it's handled as to whether it's better to train further or closer to the next match. But again, it shows the influence and presence of load is probably one of the biggest effectors or drivers of the recovery process. So what you prescribe and how you prescribe after your matches becomes critical to driving recovery, whether it's following training or matches for that example. So that's low. If we move to the next idea now, so nutrition, I guess as a generic synopsis, probably the nicest recent evidence from a football perspective is this UEFA expert group statement that we put together with a host of other superstar academics and researchers and football people. And I guess when you collate a lot of the research from a nutrition perspective on recovery, the biggest things that come out are the volume and to a lesser extent the timing of the macronutrient availability, particularly carbohydrates and protein in a post-match, post-training environment. So regardless of the wish and desires to focus on micronutrients, the best evidence to implicitly affect or suggest the effect of improved or negated recovery comes from the presence or absence of macronutrients, mainly carbohydrates and proteins. And it's kind of obvious, everyone knows it. I guess the thing about it is that most of the nutritional and hydrational intake following particularly matches, sometimes even training, happens away from the club for most players for the next 24 to 48 hours, certainly 24 hours. So what the behavior patterns are, what the normal expectations are about nutritional intake are often done away from the club, which is fine from a personal perspective, but how do you know what your players are doing depending on their professionalism, their behaviors, their knowledge and attitudes to nutritional intake? So again, focusing on getting those macronutrients right is important. And I guess this is a study that's not specifically for football, but it's one I like because we did it a few years ago and kind of shows the kind of person I am. But we had a bunch of amateur athletes, team sport athletes, and we told them that we were giving them two different nutritional types of meal intakes, particularly from Australian athletes traveling into Asia where the food is quite different. But in reality, what we were giving them was a high carbohydrate and a low carbohydrate. So a big energy difference through carbohydrates. And what we saw was the day after they had a training session, and the second day they came back and did a match simulation. And for the high carbohydrate diet, they replenished carbohydrates in the muscle, so muscle glycogen. But for the low carbohydrate diet, which is not unnecessarily low, it could quite easily be consumed. If someone was a little bit slack, we saw a massive reduction in muscle glycogen. And this is without the players or without the subjects actually knowing. And we see when they come back, without actually knowing their lower glycogen at the start and reduced distance in the low carbohydrate. So again, it's a simple thing that if you have a large training load, large match load, the presence and the absence of macronutrient in terms of carbohydrate is critical for recovery in the next 24, 48 hours, and performance suffers whether they know it or not. I guess from a protein perspective, we know that in terms of protein is probably less important from an acute performance perspective, but from an adaptation and recovery from muscle damage, muscle fatigue, it has critical importance in the diet. We know from our fractional synthetic rate of the measure of myofibrillar synthesis, so the building of muscle protein, that the presence of protein in the hours following the exercise load is critical. So the presence of protein following a match is critical to then drive that fractional synthetic rate of muscle building, so myofibrillar protein synthesis. So, critically important regardless of the sport, regardless of the athlete. And when we look at different types, we know that probably whey is better than soy, better than casein. But even so, simple milk powders often drive what is required. So expensive supplements are not necessarily needed as long as the integrity is known. But again, that increase in fractional synthetic rate, so the uptake of protein into the muscle following exercise that helps drive recovery, requires the presence of sufficient volume of protein based on body size to help drive that protein synthesis. So again, it goes back to the basic foundations of plenty of carbohydrate, plenty of protein in that post-match, post-training window helps drive the physiological and performance recovery factors. Alcohol consumption, and being Australian, it's certainly hypocritical of me to tell people not to drink, but the presence of alcohol is well known to slow or retard the recovery process. We had a group of rugby league players undertake a match, and then we gave them a night drinking alcohol with us or not drinking alcohol with us. And we can see from even just simple counter movement jumps that there's a real switch in their ability to produce force, in the day after the morning after a drinking session where they had 1 gram of kilogram